Good morning to everybody joining us from the United States. Good afternoon to those joining from Europe, and good evening to everyone from Japan. A warm welcome to all our participants in this Zoom session and those joining us live via YouTube to discuss the ongoing reorientation of the EU and its member states in the trade, tech, and digital domains in the transatlantic context and with like-minded partners. My name is Maaike Okano-Heijmans. I'm a senior research fellow at the Clingendael Institute in The Hague, and I will be your moderator in this online session. As most of you will have realized by now, Clingendael published a report last December on dealing with China in the high-tech domain. This report included views from many different experts of 6 different countries. And we have 3 of them with us today to discuss our findings and, of course, also to take into account now the Biden administration's policies that, well, at least now we can have some expectations of getting started. Even though we all know, of course, that in the first few months, the focus will be on the United States itself. As you can see in this slide that my colleague just put up, we in our reports have illustrated also the fact that even though European policies have evolved, there's actually still quite a bit of divergences on where we stand, both in approaches and in appreciation of China's policies in the high-tech domain. Even though Europeans are also starting to act on the awareness that some geopolitical challenges, especially those dealing with China, cannot be dealt with in the liberal democratic mindset alone. A German policy maker recently put it nicely, as he said, that we realize now also that the world is full of carnivores, whereas the Europeans, we are vegetarians. So finding ways to deal with partners with this new challenge is really a challenge of our time. And we're very happy that we have an excellent panel here for you today. I will introduce them just before they speak, but let me just mention their names. As you can see probably in your screen, we have John Seaman joining from IFRI. We have William Reinsch joining from CSIS in Washington. We have Kazuto Suzuki from Tokyo University in Tokyo, of course. And we have Wienand Kwaadvlieg, who should be in Brussels, but considering COVID circumstances, I believe is actually in The Hague. He will present a business view, of course, on this very topic. So in the next 75 minutes, we will share with you a wide variety of views. But before going there, let me give the floor to Dorine van Norren of the Western Hemisphere Department at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who actually commissioned this project. Dorine, on to you.
Thank you, Maaike. I want to welcome you all on behalf of the Western Hemisphere Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm the strategic advisor there, and unfortunately our director couldn't be here today, but she will be joining for the follow-up seminars because there are 2 more webinars to go, one on 18th of February and one on 23rd of March. These will be joined by the Deputy Director General for Foreign Economic Relations, Peter Potman, and the last one by our Director of the Western Hemisphere Department, Yvette Eeghout. First of all, I want to thank all the representatives of the think tanks that are present here for participating in this advisory report of Clingendael Institute. We are very happy that so many high-quality research institutes from around the world chose to participate. Your contribution is much valued, and it gives us precious insights on how to deal with China's rise in high-tech and both the defensive and the offensive measures to take. And I, of course, want to thank Clingendael, especially Maaike Okano and Brigitte Dekker, for bringing you all together in what promises to be 3 exciting webinars. We started this research project in a different era under President Trump, when it became clear that tensions between the US and China were rising and global power competition is increasing. Just 3 days ago on Monday, a high Chinese official, the director of the Central Foreign Affairs Commission of the Chinese Communist Party, in a speech called for the US and China to mend relations. And he appealed to the US for more cooperation. It seems, however, that the tensions and the great power competition are here to stay, as the Biden administration takes a tough stance on China. It is one of the few issues on which there is bipartisan consensus. And the same top diplomat that I just quoted from China stressed that whilst China has no intention to challenge or replace the US position in the world, no force can hold back China's development. So where do we position ourselves as Europeans, and how do we cooperate and coordinate with like-minded countries? We are here today discussing what is Europe's role in the great power competition and what position the Netherlands should take. I would be very curious to hear from my co-panelists what your top 3 recommendations are for the Netherlands as a member of the EU and of course as a close ally to the US. Thank you, Maaike.
Thank you very much, Dorine, for explicating indeed in a bit more detail what the report was about. And of course, we'll hear much more details from the experts themselves. So let me turn to that. John, I think we should go first with the European view, and a very particular one, the French view. We have sort of a set of 3 questions that we asked all of you to reflect on in about 5 to 10 minutes. And the first one is, of course, share a few key findings that you presented also in your chapter on dealing with China. Also, please share with us some of your expectations for your own government's policy. And then perhaps what should we as European Union, and perhaps specifically the Netherlands, after all, we've seen quite a bit of intensification of relations between France and the Netherlands in recent months, or in the past year, I should say. If you have any thoughts on that, of course, very welcome. Glad to have you here, John.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Maaike. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you to the Dutch Foreign Ministry for this this opportunity and for financing this all of this work. Thank you to Clingendael. It's always a great pleasure to work with Clingendael anytime I get the chance. So for all of those of you who are listening who haven't had the opportunity, if Clingendael comes knocking, you should definitely say yes. So thanks also to Maaike, you and Brigitte for piloting this report, which is really excellent. And my contribution, of course, has been quite modest, looking from a French point of view and a European perspective to some extent. But I also have to thank my co-authors here at IFRI, Marc-Julien and Françoise Nicolas, who were instrumental in writing the chapter. But I also have to say that the views that I'm going to present here today are my own responsibility, and so that shouldn't necessarily reflect negatively on them if you don't like what I say. So. I also need to say at the outset that I realize now that my talk is dealing a bit more with the like-minded partner side, in particular the U.S., than it is dealing directly with China. But we can definitely get to that in the discussion. Let me start by recognizing that we are in the midst of a major structural turning point in world history that will, among other things, determine whether or not Europe will continue to be prosperous and relevant in global affairs, or rather become a playing field or an object of great power competition. Somebody would even say that this ship has already sailed and that it's too late. But that's an object of it's a topic of debate and a point of view I wouldn't necessarily agree with. To put it simply, the structural shift in the balance of power and the deepening U.S.-China competition is coinciding with a technological revolution, or the so-called fourth industrial revolution, that is already fundamentally restructuring the way that our societies and our economies are organized, and is opening the door for new areas of competition for leadership in the high-tech industries of the future. For now, what we see emerging in the digital technology space are two interconnected but increasingly opposing systems, neither of which I would say Europe is fully comfortable with. On the one hand is the rise of the technologically enhanced authoritarianism and a clear strengthening of the surveillance state in China in particular. We clearly have problems in engaging with Beijing in this context, and are looking for ways to avoid finding ourselves in a relationship of dependence with China. On the other hand, we are clearly dependent on the US digital ecosystem, but are concerned about its development. The rise of the GAFA and digital monopolies, as well as corporate-driven surveillance capitalism, if we can call it that, in the United States, appears to be developing into its own form of techno-authoritarianism. So while there is clearly a need to work with the United States, and we are finally relieved to see Washington recognize the importance of working with allies, there are some important issues to deal with in relation to American technological supremacy, not least of which is building an element of trust in the digital arena, which has significantly degraded really ever since the Snowden revelations. So in our chapter, we explored 3 points of friction: data management, taxation, and digital governance. But without really going into much detail on these, let me just cite 2 conceptual divergences as an illustration of some of the difficulties ahead. One is the conceptual basis for data management. France and Europe consider data privacy as a right of its citizens to be respected, rather than a privilege or a commodity to be sold. And this is really the basis of the GDPR, and precisely the reason why the safe harbor and the privacy shield agreements with the US have failed. Second is on digital governance more broadly. France is increasingly defending the concept of a digital commons, treating access to the internet once again as a right, and the internet itself as a common good, wherein the principle of net neutrality is a crucial pillar. So when the FCC in the US struck down the net neutrality concept in December 2017 and adopted a principle of fast lane access to paid content, this undermined what France considers a core principle of the internet as a common good. So when we consider how to work together as allies and like-minded countries to deal with China on high-tech issues, we need to consider how to overcome some fundamental divergences. For Europe, the broader question is really how to avoid becoming technologically dependent on China, on the one hand, and on the other hand, how to deal with our current over-dependence on the United States. And in dealing with these issues, 2 pillars really prop up the French approach, I would say. First, if we were in a conference room, I would probably ask you to all say it together with me. First is working to develop Europe's strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty, to allow Europe a degree of resilience and maneuverability. And here I'll give a couple of illustrations. First, in 5G, France has sought to find an effective intermediary solution to avoid becoming dependent on Chinese technology and the security concerns that this implies, while not yielding to US pressure to enact a blanket ban of Chinese vendors. Next, there is also a clear recognition that France and Europe as a whole need to invest in digital solutions. This has been outlined, for instance, in the Franco-German manifesto for European industrial policy that was developed last spring to pump money into European innovation. And here the development, for example, of a Franco-German cloud solution or Gaia X is a good example. We also have examples of how a French national cloud solution has failed in the past, but this is definitely something that France is trying to push forward in a cloud solution. So this investment, industrial policy approach also seeks to adopt and to reinforce defensive measures. For instance, the European investment screening framework, or a reciprocity mechanism for public procurement with third countries. And finally, it looks to make changes to the European competition framework. And on this last point, the idea is to make the EU's competition framework more flexible and forward-looking, and in the digital field in particular, revise competition policy to allow for the emergence of European champions in areas where Europe is not competitive today. It's important to understand, I think, that for France, competition policy is considered as a component or as a complement of industrial policy, and incorporates a dimension of state intervention to enhance competitiveness. I would imagine this is somewhat of a problem for many of you in the Netherlands. It is clearly a source of divergence with the United States as well, of course. And so I think a key underlying question in all of this is to what extent will the United States tolerate, accept, accommodate Europe and European efforts to bolster its digital sovereignty and a broader degree of strategic autonomy. Now, one risk of pursuing a strategy of digital sovereignty is ultimately a further fragmentation of the global digital space. In Europe, we don't like this concept of decoupling. We've said it's a dirty word, but we also have to admit that strategic autonomy is a form of decoupling in reality. So in this sense, deepening multilateral engagement on digital issues, particularly with like-minded countries, is crucial to maintaining a level of global digital connectivity within this context. And in this respect, the second pillar really of France's approach is to engage in multilateral efforts to find global solutions to many of the challenges that arise from technological change. The idea here is ultimately to bake French and European interests and core values into digital and tech governance moving forward. And I think I've already been perhaps too pessimistic for my own liking, but let me just say this in conclusion of my preliminary my first remarks here. It is fundamental that we work together as like-minded countries in dealing with China, but we also need to figure out just where our like-mindedness lies and beware of effectively navigate the areas where we have serious divergences. So let me, I've probably already been too long, so let me leave it there for now, and I'll let you manage. And Maaike, thank you.
Thank you, John. That's an excellent kickoff and a very specifically French, but also a European view. I think that is increasingly more shared in other EU member states. In that sense, we're all becoming more French rather than Dutch, I would say, here in Europe. Strategic autonomy is definitely something that I expect Bill to respond to in a minute. And perhaps for in the questions that I'm sure you will get another chance to speak again, John. I would love to hear more on how you see that France is going to balance the twofold threat or challenge that you mentioned. It's not just about China, but also the United States. And what does it mean? In Europe, there has been talk about there's no equidistance, of course. Let's be clear on that also. But between the EU and the US, and the EU and China on the other hand. So what does that mean of our, well, the grand bargain, I suppose, that we are all aiming for? With that in mind, Bill, in your chapter, I recall that you said a few things that really triggered me. One was really that it's not clear to many in the United States that the Europeans, that EU policies in these fields are really focused on the real threat that is China. And now, well, you've had your European view sort of confirming that, I suppose. Second, I recall one of your points that a substantial element of hypocrisy seems to be present in EU statements in support of the multilateral approach. So perhaps in your kickoff remarks, will you please also reflect on those points? Let's move to you, Bill. Of course, let me introduce you a little bit further. Bill has been for many years now a chair for international business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. But important to know is that you served for, I believe, 15 years as president of the National Foreign and Trade Council. So many of your views on the need for open markets and non-unilateral measures in the trade field do, of course, also impact your thinking. Bill, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Maaike. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you. It's really an honor to be associated with something that Clingendael does. It's one of the premier institutions, think tanks in Europe, and it's really, as I said, an honor to be part of this process. As you might imagine, I do have some slightly different views from John, which we'll get to. The United States first is in a little bit of an unusual situation because we're essentially transitioning from between two very different administrations. I'm not going to spend much time talking about the last 4 years. You all know about that, but he's gone, more or less. And we have a new president who is still defining policy, particularly with respect to China, and has been explicit in saying that a lot of things are going to be under review, and that only now beginning. So we can speculate, but we cannot say definitively how things are going to proceed. I think the context, though, is important, and that is that I'm going to use a term I hate, but it's appropriate in this case. It's the policy space that we have in the United States has significantly narrowed over the last few years. Public opinion has shifted markedly in an anti-Chinese direction. More than 70% of the American people view China unfavorably. That is echoed in our legislative branch in the Congress. And both of our parties have become strongly skeptical of China. And I would say that has very little to do with Donald Trump. It has a lot to do with the actions of the Chinese government with respect to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, with respect to Hong Kong, threats in Taiwan, aggressive actions in the South China Sea, repression of journalists, and other generally repressive actions being taken inside China. These have all resonated with Americans, and you've seen a very sharp trend. It also has political implications in the United States. The party that is now out of power, the Republicans, want to portray the new president, Joe Biden, as soft on China and not willing to take the hard actions that are necessary. Everything he does will be criticized. There are 4 Republican senators, all of whom want to be president in 2024. They are competing with each other to see who can be toughest on China. So we're in for, the relationship is in for a difficult time, partly because of politics, but partly because of genuine disagreement with the policies that China is pursuing. In that context, I think the prevailing view, however, is that what the previous president did was a case of right diagnosis, wrong prescription. That his identification of the problems that the United States has with China in terms of subsidies, support for state-owned enterprises, forced technology transfer, the things that are embedded into their, basically into the policy that's exemplified in their 13th and forthcoming 14th five-year plans and their publication made in China 2025, is they want to create, through means that are not always legal under international rules, national champions that will compete with and presumably surpass European and American leaders in key high-tech sectors. It's sort of our, that's fine for them to have that goal. It's our job to make sure they don't succeed, and I think defend the ability of American and European companies to compete. That gets into what is the right prescription. And for Biden, I think it begins with a metaphor. And it's a metaphor that I would encourage Europe to think about as well when it comes to the question that John raises: how do we support, how does Europe support its own high-tech industries? And the metaphor is simple. When you're in a race, there are only 2 ways to win. You can run faster or you can trip the other guy. And we spend a lot of time, and the last administration spent a lot of time figuring out how to trip the other guy. And that's not an inappropriate strategy. Particularly if the other guy is cheating. Accountability is important, and all governments have tools, and the WTO has approved tools to take on countries that undermine the trading system by violating the rules. At the same time, I think the incoming administration in the United States is seized with the running faster part of the metaphor, because that's the thing that we can control. At the end of the day, we don't control the Chinese economy, and neither does Europe. We control the American economy, and the EU and Europe, the member states, control European economies. So that's where we should put our energy. And the Biden administration has noted that we are beginning not so much to fall behind, but we are beginning to lose our leadership position. The funding of basic R&D is basic research is lagging. Some of our efforts to protect intellectual property are lagging, and our efforts to develop comprehensive national policies on some of the things that John mentioned, like privacy and internet governance, are also lagging. And what we're learning vis-a-vis the EU is that it's fine if you not to agree with their approach, which we don't, but you can't beat something with nothing, as far from a policy point of view, and we too often have nothing. So I think you're going to find the Biden administration focusing on a lot of efforts to strengthen America's competitive position. And I'll mention a few of those as we go along. At the same time, the biggest difference between the two presidents is that Trump was a confirmed unilateralist. Biden is a confirmed multilateralist. He believes in teams, he believes in cooperation, he believes in coalition building, and that's what he's going to set out to do, to approach China collectively rather than individually. While I think Europe is not the only partner that we will be seeking, it's hard to envision an effective coalition without Europe. And so from my perspective, I think there's going to be a lot more attention paid to Europe from the United States than there has been previously. The relationship is not in good shape, thanks to the previous administration, and not just on trade. We need to repair NATO. We need to develop a much more coordinated approach dealing with Russia. We need to do a lot of things, and I think this administration is going to be focused on them. I think John is right that building a coalition in the trade area is going to be more difficult than people think. Basically, agreement in principle at the 30,000 meter level is easy. We can all agree there's a common challenge and it's important. But I think trying to figure out exactly what we ought to do together at ground level is going to prove to be much more difficult. And you can see that already in some divergent approaches that Europe and the United States are taking. My perception is that Europe, I think, is conflicted on how to proceed. And that conflict is reflected in the debate over what strategic autonomy means and what technology autonomy means. I've asked multiple Europeans that question, get a different answer every time. And I think this is something that Europe has to sort out for itself. I mean, from the United States point of view, the fundamental question is, does Europe want to move in the direction of essentially being a third force between China and the United States? Or does it want to work hand in hand with the United States to confront a challenge that is common to both of us? The US view, as you might expect, favors the latter. And we go back to one of our Revolutionary War heroes, Benjamin Franklin, who said, not about Europe, because we were fighting the British at the time, but said basically, we must all hang together or else we will all hang separately. And I think that's the situation in which we find ourselves now. The China challenge in economic terms, I think, cannot be met by either of us individually. It can be met by us collectively working together to mobilize the largest middle-class consumer market in the world to basically create and administer a rules-based, rule of law-based, non-authoritarian system. But accomplishing that is going to take a lot of work and a lot of coming together on things that divide us. So the president's going to attempt to build a coalition. He'll probably continue phase one of our policy. After all, why not? It was a 2-year deal, and they're actually implementing a lot of the provisions of the deal. So I would expect that to continue. I think the coalition building will continue. One thing that will be new is that human rights issues, as you've already seen, will be a much bigger part of the Biden policy. This is politics, but it is also sincere. The president thinks that America should stand up for democracy and should oppose authoritarianism and oppose repression. And there are increasing Chinese examples of exactly that. And I think you'll find America being more outspoken about that. I think one part of our policy that will be more distasteful from the European point of view is that the Biden administration will encourage reshoring. They want companies to come back to America. I don't think they'll succeed in doing that. And I don't think that you're going to see much happening beyond rhetoric there, but it's going to be part of the policy. In terms of what, I'll close with this, in terms of what I think Europe ought to be thinking about, and would be a forum for further discussion. First is that hopefully agree with Benjamin Franklin that it's better to hang together than hang separately. And understand, I think, clearly that the terms I mentioned, strategic autonomy and technology autonomy, regardless of what you think they mean, in the United States, they are being interpreted as intentions to carve out a separate path for the United States and to do it at the expense of US high-tech companies. And I think the US view is we have issues with the GAFA companies, as John mentioned. We have issues with those companies as well. And you can tell our Congress intends to deal with them, but there are companies. And there's a good bit of resentment in the United States about Europe's effort to deal with our companies. We would like to think that we can take care of those problems. Now, of course, your nations are sovereign and you have to do what you have to do. But this is not the strategic autonomy is not a policy that's being viewed benignly in the United States. And I think that we have to have much more discussion about that and some in-depth discussion. In that light, I would also encourage Europe and the European Parliament to take a closer look at the comprehensive agreement on investment with China and see if the opportunities that it presents really are as great as the Commission has claimed, and whether the concessions that the Chinese have made are as meaningful as the Commission has claimed. I'm inclined to think not, and there's a good number of people in Europe that think not as well. That's a debate for Europe. That's not a debate for the United States. But I think it's one that Europe needs to have, because in the process of having it, I think you will arrive then at a clearer sense of where Europe wants to go and what kind of role it wants to carve out for itself. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Bill. That's a lot of food for thought and for discussion that we will surely have after the next two introductions. I'm very tempted to respond to many of the things you say, including, well, yes, we will be having that discussion, of course, not just in the European Parliament, but perhaps even in the national parliaments about the comprehensive agreement on investment with China. That's not so much on the topic for discussion here today, as we focus on high-tech and digital more, but that's definitely one that we should also be having with our American friends. I think even at this stage, a bit of explaining and a bit of, jointly learning, I suppose, or reflecting on what concessions might actually mean or bring in the future. On strategic autonomy, yes, there's a lot to be said. And I think it's really important for us here to know how others view this. I personally tend to see this as your run faster metaphor. And that's, I think, what most of us here in Europe are trying to, are thinking of when we say strategic autonomy. But let me invite a view from Japan, and perhaps including a reflection on how you see strategic autonomy. Whether it's aimed perhaps also at Japanese companies. I've heard some worries from Japanese companies, much less, of course, than from United States side. But Professor Suzuki, I should introduce you as from, of course, Tokyo University. Please share with us your views on all of this.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me for this very interesting panel. And thank you very much for Clingendael for organizing this seminar. And I think it is my honor to be here and happy to present the Japanese point of view. Well, on the strategic autonomy, yes, there is a strong concern that from the Japanese point of view, the confrontation with China is always as a strategic one rather than just a technological issue, because we are facing the real threat of the confrontation at the territorial dispute around Senkaku Islands, and China has been the sort of a first adversary to deal with. But on the other hand, China is the largest trading partner, and we do have a very deepened interdependency with the Chinese economy. And of course, one of the most largest destination of the Japanese high-tech goods is China. And we do have the very dense network of the global supply chain with China and around the Asian countries. And therefore, it is very difficult for Japan to be confrontational as Japan as a country alone against China. And we are not capable of containing and confronting with China in the high-tech issue. So from Japanese point of view, the most important thing is the solidarity of the Western countries and like-minded countries. But the concept of the European autonomy or strategic autonomy is giving a very big concern about the spat between the United States and Europe, and where Japan tried to mediate and try to form sort of a triangulate or a grouping of the coalition to confront against the sort of an expansion of influence of China using its economic leverage and technological leverage to the other countries. So we are sincerely hoping that there will be a sort of a manageable understanding of the strategic autonomy of Europe, and which will be acceptable to United States, and combine that together with the like-minded countries, including Japan, Australia, and other Asian partners, as to build a bloc to confront against the Chinese expansion. One of the key factor is the trust. The Japan, the former Prime Minister Abe has presented the idea of the data free flow with trust, and this is one of the proposal to mend the fence between the United States and Europe. Particularly, this was during the Trump administration, to make sure that we do have the pool of the big data with United States, Japan, and Europe in order to confront with the data, which is the population of the 1.4 billion country. I think the number means a lot because the more you have the data, more you have the opportunity to grow the industries such as artificial intelligence and big data and all kinds of modern IT businesses. So I think if we let China to do its own business, and they run faster than any other country, and we all work together and play like a relay to compete against the growth of the Chinese industry. So this is the data free flow with trust is one of the way in which to propose the sort of a middle ground between the U.S. industrial-oriented data policy and the European GDPR. The other point is the decoupling. I think we don't really believe that it is possible to decouple everything, but we need to make sure that where we draw a line between which is the strategic technology and which are the important technology. For example, during this COVID-19 situation, we are now talking about the masks and all this PPE, the personal protection equipment, as a strategic assets. And we haven't really thought about that, but we need to redefine what are the strategic items to be controlled and to protect from this interdependency with China. This is on the other hand, I think there should be a room for more trade with China for the commodities which doesn't really touch upon the strategic interest of our countries. So there is a proposal from the ruling party LDP to re-establish the concept of economic security. And we are now pushing forward the idea of the sort of common economic security alliance with the Europe and United States. So that is one of the direction forward in coming years for Japan, and that is the expectation of Japan for Europe to be responsive for to see in the more bigger picture, not in the bilateral context with United States, but to have it in the wider picture, to establish more stronger alliance with the like-minded countries in order to confront the aggressive expansion of the Chinese influence. So I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to join the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And indeed, I think we see some of that already happening. In the past year, I've seen more interest both from the Japanese side in engaging with Europe, and equally more interest from the European side engaging with Japan. So I think much of this is obviously already happening, but the devil is in the detail. And the detail is with businesses. Winand, your view from a business perspective, perhaps a few reflections on what has been said, and as of course the head of the Brussels office of the Dutch Confederation of Industries and Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, I'm sure you have your own perspectives, not yet publicly, fleshed out in a report, as the German counterpart already has it. BDI put out a paper in early 2019, but I know that you're also having internal discussions on EU industrial policy, including a link to strategic autonomy. So please share with us some of your insights.
Okay, thank you, Maaike, for giving me the floor, and thanks for Clingendael for inviting me. In first place, I would like to make the compliments for this initiative and also for the excellent report. I think it's really very good reading, very interesting. As you said already, there is not yet an established business perspective, so what I will present to you all is a number of reflections, not a real established business position. I think our subject of today is simply the key issue in Brussels. Every serious subject on the EU agenda is in some way related to the triangle EU, US, China. And China is not a bilateral issue, it is a multilateral, it is a geopolitical issue. And I think that is one of the interesting things in Brussels now, that there is a very large degree of consensus of the overall direction of European policy, and indeed of the geopolitical situation as the basis for developing EU policy. We live in a change of era, and geopolitics is now prominently on the economic agenda of the authorities as well as of companies. Public affairs directors in big companies that were only a few years ago only dealing with subsidies and with anti-dumping examinations, etc., they suddenly find themselves in the position of having to advise on geopolitics. This adds a totally new dimension to economic reasoning, and not only costs and efficiency are relevant, but also geopolitics, and in geopolitics, additional costs and sometimes high costs are simply accepted as part of the game, which is not the normal part of corporate thinking. So that means we have to think outside the box, because the multilateral rules-based system built on the Pax Americana since the Second World War, this box simply isn't there anymore. This means for business that we are entering uncharted waters. Business ideas are evolving and new thinking is gathering pace. Bill said that the dilemma wrote that the dilemma for US business is that China is simultaneously their best customer and their biggest threat. And that is an observation that is certainly true for many EU companies as well, and as I heard, also for Japanese companies. And this dilemma was also at the center of the debate in German industry before the publication of their famous China report that you mentioned, Maaike, at the beginning of January 2019, in which China was branded a systemic competitor. In principle, I think the common analysis and the common worries of US, EU, and Japan and others could also easily provide a good basis for a fruitful dialogue between the US and EU business. I'm therefore less pessimistic that we would not be able to agree on a joint plan of action, and this joint plan of action should then develop into a more multilateral approach of like-minded countries. One example of an agenda point where I think thorough dialogue is possible and necessary is indeed in the digital field, building on what John also said. There are divergences, but there is also a widespread recognition, and in the US and in the EU, that the competitive position of a very small number of big tech firms and their privileged tax position as well is jeopardizing key values of the market economy. So I think on the basis of that recognition, it must be possible to find a way forward and in a dialogue. The OECD, of course, is already working on this subject in a number of fields, and I think we should simply pursue this approach. And in a respectful dialogue, many things can be sorted out, and the basis for such a dialogue is certainly there again with the Biden administration, which of course does not mean that it's going to be a walk in the park. It will be very complicated, but I think there is a way forward. Then coming on the business views. Well, in the first place, we see a changing landscape and we see a lot of uncertainty. As we can see in Professor Suzuki's approach in the report, Japan has clearly made up its mind. And in an early stage, years ago, it is open about the threat from China. It decided to stay very close to the US, and in most of the cases follows US leadership in the domain of economic security vis-à-vis China. With the change of China perceptions in the EU, Japan also sees increased possibilities to cooperate with the EU. And furthermore, Japan actively encourages Japanese companies in China to relocate to Japan or elsewhere. And apparently hundreds of companies are doing so. European business is certainly not, or not yet, has not come to those clear conclusions. Seen from the US and from Japan, as we saw in the report, the EU lags behind in the appreciation of the strategic threats coming from China. I think that is something which is very, very rapidly and profoundly changing. And I think this seminar is also a clear recognition of this fact. EU business is much more aware of what is happening in China, but it is also very uncomfortable with the idea that it should just follow the US lead. And I think that is a common feeling in France and Germany, in other countries. And EU business also wants to avoid being trapped in a squeeze between China and the US, which does not mean that squeeze is already there, because the high-tech companies, they are simply in this position. They have American technology, they want to export to China, they need also Chinese technology, they are in that squeeze. Now, what is in this situation a no-regret policy? And I think then technology is simply key in all these geopolitical developments. So boosting research and development and innovation should be the key of EU and international relations policy, and also the centerpiece of the reviewed EU industrial policy that's coming out in next March. Does this mean that the EU should go for strategic autonomy? Well, I think the simple fact is that full strategic autonomy is not possible, and it's also not desirable, but a larger degree of strategic autonomy should certainly be an aim. It is a question of degree of what you want to achieve. And then there is a question, will the US accept it? Whether can it see the value of such a development in the EU? I think it is a value because it would create simultaneously more independence for the EU and a more valuable ally for the US. Bill notes that there are mixed feelings in the US towards a stronger EU because on the one hand, EU strength is welcomed as a counterweight to China. That's the national security dimension. And on the other hand, it is seen as a threat to the competitiveness of US companies, and that's the competitiveness angle. Once again, I think the US should recognize the value of a strong EU, even if the EU would sometimes be a troublesome ally. On the fundamentals, we agree. Both France and Germany certainly do so, although they are maneuvering to keep some independence. And I think in this respect, one of the most interesting ideas in the report is from James Lewis, where he says the US can support a drive for technological parity by Europe rather than the pursuit of technological sovereignty. And I think technological parity, being a roughly equal partner and for the US and for China in this triangle, I think that is in principle, a realistic aim. And it is also an aim which would at the same time reinforce European security and reinforce American security, because the EU would not become threatening, but the value would increase, and a strong ally is always a good ally. I am not afraid at all that more strategic autonomy of the EU would make it more protectionist or more inward looking, because the openness is the DNA of the EU and is the DNA also of European business. But a different world, of course, demands adaptations in policy elements. Then the question whether the EU can become a third way between the US and China. I think the problem of decoupling is that complete decoupling is impossible without great cost to innovation and economic growth. Partial decoupling is also unlikely because it's kind of a knitted pullover. Once you start pulling the thread, the whole pullover disappears. I think there is too much linkages in technology, but also the present situation of total openness is also unsustainable. So for the moment, I think it's a dilemma with no clear solution. And whether equidistance is possible or logical or natural, I think then we come to the fact that the values dimension is very important. And taking into account all the differences that exist, the basic societal values of the EU and of the US are, of course, closer than those or the basic values of the Chinese society. Another dimension of this strategic autonomy or strategic parity or degree of strategic autonomy is that there should be a real willingness to take action. I recently was in a discussion of a former diplomat and a Dutch diplomat in the US who said the AI was participating in a discussion on 5G, where it was brought up that, of course, the very dominant position of Huawei, and then that there were two European companies that have, in fact, a very strong technology base, Ericsson and Nokia. And then there was an immediate reaction in the US. Well, can't we support these companies? Can't we buy them up? Can we do something? Whereas in Europe, this discussion, it went on and on without a clear path of action. Now, of course, yesterday we saw that in Germany, there's now a big plan for investment in 5G technology, 2 billion to start with. So I think there is a realization that things have to be done and are going to be done. And then my last brief point is, concerning like-mindedness, I think the like-mindedness of a group of countries in the world and the need for them to work together, thinking about the EU, US, Japan, Canada, Australia, Korea, and a number of others, I think that is a path that certainly has to be developed. And I think we should look again at the enormous value of the OECD, the role that the OECD could play in this field. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wieland, for adding yet many more issues to the debate. What I should have said actually also is that our participants in the Zoom session can of course also contribute by asking questions. So invite responses from our speakers here. I noticed that Gary van Pinkster, China correspondent of one of the Dutch national dailies, she has already tipped in, and we agreed that Brigitte would be introducing the questions. So I'll turn over to her, and in the meantime, let me encourage all of you out there to also add to our Q&A session. This is your opportunity to ask questions to our panelists. Brigitte?
Yes, thank you, Maaike. I see your comment is well received. I see already some extra questions coming in, so this will be Excellent. An interesting 20 extra minutes. Yeah, the question from Gary, thank you. It's a question on strategic autonomy, and she's wondering if it isn't an overestimation of the power of Europe holds on its own. Will we in Europe not be eaten alive by China? Then she also wonders specifically to John, in addition, aren't you underpaying the strategic elements? So maybe going backwards, so Wienand, if you can respond first, and then we do just a little round before moving on to the second question.
Perhaps if I can take the liberty of being moderator here, I like yes. your idea, Wienand, of thinking of strategic autonomy in terms of a degree, not something that you're pursuing at an extreme height. So to build perhaps the point, do you think the US can see value in a higher degree of strategic autonomy of the European Union? That is, I think, a question that many of us are asking here. So as Brigitte suggested, shall we first have Wienand and then Bill and then John?
Okay, very well. The question of Gary van Pinksteren, yeah, the future will show. If we don't accelerate our tech policy, if we don't invest, then certainly China will eat us. But I think the technological base in Europe is still very strong in a number of fields. And I think if there is a concerted and a determined effort to change the situation, to improve the technological capacity and to do it quickly, I think a lot is possible. Thanks.
You want me to go next? Well, it's a good question. I think that there's going to be people here that are open to it. And I think the president's approach is always to seek a middle ground and to seek cooperation. So the door is not shut, but I think it will depend a lot on how Europe proceeds. I mean, there have been a number of things that have been distressing, and it's not so much I think well, I don't know what the intent is. I think I've learned in my time when I was more in government and politics that you never want to question anybody else's motives. You just want to question the results. But if you look at an issue that currently divides us, for example, like the digital services tax, I think there's, the United States has noted that, first of all, I think that this is a case where we ought to be working together, and maybe the OECD would be the right answer. And I think that's an example of where Biden will take a much more constructive approach than Trump did. But these companies are going to be taxed. There's no question about that. The controversy is over the allocation of the tax, not over the fact of it. And I think the United States has noted that the effect of most of the European proposals, and this is a national issue, not just an EU issue, most of the proposals end up targeting US companies and not European companies. We think that's an imbalance. If Europe is going to be receptive to probably to a broader approach that affects European companies as well as American companies, then I think we can make some progress. It's not resistance to taxation; it's resistance to inequity. That's the problem. And I think it's spurred on by something that I said earlier, which is you can't beat something with nothing. And I think that applies on both sides. The United States has been behind the curve, if you will, in developing policies of its own on digital governance, on privacy, and a host of areas where Europe has really led the world. We used to say, that China was going to become the world's factory, and Europe is well on its way to becoming the world's bureaucracy. That may or may not be a good thing. You have to decide. But the failure of the United States to come up with alternatives has made GDPR and I think probably, if we continue to fail to do this, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, sort of the default solution for businesses everywhere. But on the other side, Europe needs to think about the same cliche about not beating something with nothing. If you're unhappy with U.S. leadership in the high-tech sphere, then I think the answer is develop competitive companies. That's the running faster answer. I think that that basically attempting to cripple the American companies is not the path to success. Running faster is the path to success. If we can both focus on that, then I think that we can work together.
Thanks, Bill. I think many of us here would say we are the world's regulator, not the world's bureaucracy. Anyway, turn to John to respond.
All right, thanks. I've got a fair number of things to say. I'll try to be brief. Let me just come back to this strategic autonomy point very quickly. I like this idea that James Lewis put out in the paper about technological parity as opposed to sovereignty. I think that's a good idea. I think one thing that we need to emphasize when we talk about autonomy is that we're not talking about independence necessarily. I mean, we're not talking about trying to make Europe some completely independent or a break off of the United States, but where our interests don't necessarily align, Europe needs to be able to pursue those interests. It's not about closing European market to American firms, from what I understand. If we're talking about strategic autonomy in the defense sector, it's not about turning your back on the United States. There's a clear recognition that in a strategic sense, we are aligned and will always be aligned with the United States. Well, always, I guess, maybe is a big word, but are definitely aligned strategically with the United States, and that's not going to change. Where the debate about strategic autonomy really started to come about was in the defense sector, but it was really in relation to the U.S.'s turn towards China, to what many saw as the detriment of attention on Europe. And so basically, in this sense, it's, Europe needs to be able to pursue its own interests without necessarily having to rely on the United States. So that where a debate that first started sort of in the defense sector has now bled off into a larger debate in the larger economy. But I really think it's important to emphasize this fact that even in a French point of view, and I think the French officials I'm surprised my telephone hasn't rung already, but probably would want to slap me on the hand if I had suggested that in any way a strategic autonomy is some sort of strategic break with the United States. That is definitely not what they have in mind. On this question about underplaying the strategic elements, I'm assuming this is in relation to concerns about China. I would not want to underplay those at all. I think to the contrary. I'm actually very surprised with where things have gone as far as the comprehensive agreement on investment. My take on Europe is that we are moving in a general direction of much more strategic thinking with relation to China. It seems that this investment agreement is a bit of a trip up. I will be surprised if it makes it through the parliament. It seems to be having a lot of resistance. The general trend seems to be that we do need to have a much more concerted strategy on China. We have sort of a half-baked strategy that we came out with in a strategic concept in 2019 about thinking of China as a partner, as a competitor, as a rival. We are very much in the embryonic stages of thinking about where that's going to end up. But we need to move forward on how we piece together all of our different all the different elements of our relationship with China and think in a much more strategic way. So I don't want to underplay the strategic elements of dealing with China whatsoever.
Perhaps, John, because that's a nice bridge to Japan, actually.
Yeah.
Because Japan has been, of course, also not taking the conflictual approach. It's sort of engaging without endorsing, I would say. So that's resisting and engaging at the same time. I do sense that this is also where Europe is headed, and maybe is there a lesson there to be learned from how you have dealt with that balance of, you know, keeping the United States very close, but at the same time still open for engagement of China, at least in some sectors. As you said, you know, strategic autonomy has to be also in certain sectors.
Right. Thank you, Mike. I think the Japanese approach was to make sure that we do have a clear, visible line between what is strategic and what is not, and make sure that we don't cross that past each other, and make sure that, you know, these strategic items needs to be contained, and make sure that we have to think about the consequence of our actions. I think these strategic control of the items, you know, the strategic control of the investment is just tools for achieving the strategic goals. So what are the strategic goals? And I think this is not extremely clear when we hear the strategic autonomy of the European countries. I think one of the most important thing for Japan is that China is an existential threat, and we are facing the China as a physical threat into our territory, and make sure that we are not engaging and enhancing or contributing the enhancement of the Chinese military and strategic capabilities. So the strategic capabilities, including not only the military, but also the informational warfare, psychological warfare, and make sure that the China will not develop its capability of extending its influence to the other countries, for example, in the Indo-Pacific states like Sri Lanka. So what we are trying to do is to approach this strategic goal by many other means, not only the technological issue, but also using the diplomacy, international aid, and other various things to make sure that China should be contained, and its influence is to make sure that to compete in the domains where the China is trying to achieve. And we also identify some of the areas where the China is desperate to access the technologies. For example, the 5G technologies is one thing, but also issues with space technology or technology on the material. And one of the issue is Japan has already have the international competitive industry, such as in the machine tools or advanced material, and we are trying to be more assertive to control these items, whereas we relax on the other commodities. So that's how we define where the strategic the line between the strategic and the commodity draws.
Thanks for that. I believe we have several more questions in the chat now. So over to you, Brigitte.
Yes, that's true. I think we can now go back to the transatlantic coordination, just from the EU-Japan to the EU-US relationship. And then we have a question from Ferdinand Schaff from the Federation of German Industries, BDI, from the much applauded paper already also discussed here. And he's wondering, while he fully agrees that the transatlantic coordination on China is much needed, how big is the appetite in the US for finding middle ground solutions in order to achieve a common China strategy with allies? In particular, are there any signs that the Biden administration might develop a more balanced, targeted approach to decoupling? Well, I think, Bill, this is your question.
Well, yeah, I really, I was just reading it here. That's why my face suddenly got larger. I think I really answered that before. I think that there is, there's a willingness here to look for new solutions and cooperative solutions. I mean, what I tried to say, I probably wasn't very clear in the beginning, was that the tone of the administration policy will be very different in the last 4 years. We don't, the current administration, I think, it's not going to bully, bluster, threaten. It's a different style. But the fundamental issues that we have with China have not changed. I mean, particularly the fundamental economic issues have not changed. But I think what has changed is the willingness to seek collective solutions. And I think there's a recognition on the president's part that if you're going to go down that path, then you have to be prepared to make some adjustments in your strategy based on what the others want to do. That's just beginning, though. I mean, it hasn't really begun yet. It's a concept. We'll have to see how it goes. What this discussion really has been about, and I think what John was very good at pointing out in the beginning, was that there are differences between European countries and the United States over tactics, really, over how to proceed. In the past, I probably offended everybody on this meeting, but I've offended my European colleagues in the past by saying that from our point of view, Europe is about now probably 2 years behind the United States in understanding the nature of the Chinese challenge. But you're catching up. 5 years ago, I said that you were 5 years behind. So, I think that the trend is in the same direction. I think if you, ask Vidhan that question, I think that it's what I said and what he quoted. China is simultaneously the biggest challenge and the best customer. And companies have to figure out how to deal with that dilemma. And I have to say, I don't think American companies have done a very good job of that. And I hope European companies do a better job. But that is going to inform policy, because governments are going to want to support their businesses and want to help them thrive. And one of the things that I think you're going to see more in the United States, surprising maybe for a Democratic administration, is I think more dialogue between our business community and the administration on how to proceed.
Thanks for that, Bill. And indeed, I think we are catching up on our understanding of China. But going back to that first slide, or that one and only slide that we had here on where countries stand and how positions have evolved, I think I would also like to caution against the idea that Europe is going to end up where the United States is or has been or had to move to in terms of policies. So even if our understanding improves, and I still see room for improvement. I think the discussion is so important on the differences, and acknowledging also the differences in the end point where we want to take things. I think, Brigitte, there's room for one more question. Do you want to introduce that? And then I'm afraid we're going to have to close the session.
Yes, then I will just go with the question that was asked by Wilhelm Vosse. And I think it will be really interesting to hear Winand's view on this, as it is more of a business side. Japan and Europe share a lot of principles on data privacy, DFT, GDPR. Why are there not more joint EU-Japan projects to develop their own data infrastructure, like, for example, the Franco-German initiative of Gaia-X? Also to become more independent from US and Chinese tech giants?
Yeah. Well, that is a very good question that I could also ask myself. I think, of course, that as we have seen in this discussion, There are the discussions about a bilateral relation, EU-China, EU-US, but there is also an evolving discussion of what should we do on a more multilateral level with like-minded countries. And I think that is an element coming up much stronger. So I think that is going to develop further. Maybe using this opportunity also, when we discuss, of course, the approach of business towards China, we should, of course, recognize that the business interests of individual companies can be very, very different. Some companies are having a very important market in China. Other countries are mainly feeling a very strong competitive pressure. Some companies depend on technology from China. Some companies are very worried that they will lose their technology to China. So I think there is really a very big divergence between the interests of companies. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Kazuo, maybe a final remark from your side, since this is EU-Japan, really?
Sure. I think this is a very interesting question, and I think Winan is right that we are talking too much on the bilateral context. The EU is, I think Japan is paying too much attention to what the US does and what China does, and also EU is paying too much attention on what the US does and China does. So I think as long as we are talking about in the context of bilateral relationship, the EU-Japan is the weakest link or weakest line in those four different actors. And there is a lot of potential to develop and collaborate between Japan and Europe, but neither side is paying attention to each other. So that has been the problem, and I think one of my reasons for joining this debate is to make sure that we do have a chance to do the bilateral Japan-EU relationship and also trilateral Japan-EU-US relationship in the confrontation with the Chinese aggressive expansion of its influence. So that's I think this panel will be the sort of a starting point of enhancing this bilateral and trilateral relationship.
Thank you. That's a wonderful end note to end this webinar with, because indeed, this is only the beginning of a conversation. As I said at the beginning, we have at least 2 more webinars upcoming, where we will always have a European view, an American view, and an other partner, non-transatlantic partners view, an Indian and an Australian ones, actually. So for everybody who enjoyed the debate today, please do sign up for those events also. For now, I really want to thank our very strong panelists today, John, Bill, Kazuto, and Binant. Thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.